All right, AP Psychology students, in this video, we're going to play a game called Which Does Not Belong. It's going to help us deepen our knowledge of psychology, build our schema, and most importantly, get us ready for that upcoming AP Psychology exam. Now, in this game, I'm going to show you 4 terms, concepts, or people, and you have to identify which one does not belong to the group. And before we identify which one doesn't belong, I'm going to walk you through step by step how I get to that answer. Now, before we begin, take a look in the description box below. I included this game as a Google Doc so you can practice the questions before we start to really assess your knowledge. All right, you guys ready? Let's go. All right, number 1, cochlea, fovea, lens, or retina, which does not belong. Now, if you're already thinking these are part of our senses, you are on the right track, but of course, one doesn't belong to this group. Now, to figure it out together, let's start with our most dominant sense as human beings, which is vision. All right, so how are we going to figure out which doesn't belong to the group? Well, light is going to bounce off an object and enter our eye. And what is it going to pass through first? Our cornea, our outermost transparent layer, and pass through this little dark hole called the pupil. Now, what determines how much light enters the pupil? This little muscle, the color part of our eye, called the iris, right? It's going to dilate or constrict. And behind the iris is a big structure right here that's called the lens. And this is really important. Why? It helps us focus on whatever image we're looking at. When it changes shape, we call that accommodation. Now, light is going to project from the lens onto the back of the eye. And this is where all the magic happens. This is called the retina, okay? Why is this where all the magic happens? This is where light converts into electrical signals called action potentials, right? We call this process transduction, right? Now, right in the back of the retina, right in the middle, is also a very important part. What is this? This is the fovea. This is where we have the sharpest vision. We can see really fine details of things, and it's concentrated very heavily with cones. These are a type of photoreceptors. So we have lens, fovea, and retina. All right, let's take a look. Which doesn't belong? Well, the only one not on here is our cochlea. Why is that? Because this is part of our ear auditory system. This is the snail type structure where transduction occurs in the ear. Sound waves and vibrations are going to turn into action potentials and now carry on via the auditory nerve to the brain. All right, number 2, which does not belong? Relative size, linear perspective, interposition, or convergence. Now, just like the last one, we should know what they all have in common. What is that? What we call depth perception. Let's write that in together. What do they have in common? Being able to judge depth, right? How far an object is away from me would be a nice example of depth perception. Now, what we need to know to find out the answer is the idea that depth perception can be divided into 2 types. Notice I have 2 eyes, right? We have one type called monocular cues, monocular. Okay, mono meaning 1, and we have binocular cues, okay? Bi meaning 2, right? So we have one eye, which is monocular. We can judge depth using one eye, and we can also judge depth using 2 eyes. All right, what are some examples? Well, let's take a look at some examples here. We have convergence. This is actually one of our binocular cues. Convergence. What is convergence? Well, it means converge or to come together. So as an object is coming closer to me, my eyes converge or become cross-eyed. That signals to my brain something is getting closer or something is getting farther away. Now, we also have monocular cues. Do we have some of those? We do. We have linear perspective. Let's write that in. Linear perspective. And you might be thinking, well, what is linear perspective then? Well, this is the idea when you have 2 parallel lines converge, and they seem to be getting closer together, it tells my brain things are getting farther away. We also have, let's take a look here, we have one called interposition. Interposition, which essentially means to overlap, right? So if I have an object here, like this red square, and this blue square behind it, because the blue square is blocked, it tells me that the blue square is farther away. Now we also have one more right up here, relative size, right? And what does this tell me? Well, it tells me that if I have 2 objects that are roughly the same size, the one that appears smaller is going to be perceived as farther away. All right, now we also have texture gradient and relative motion or motion parallax. Those are other binocular cues. Now, does this help us answer a question? It of course does. Why? Because the only one that doesn't belong is convergence. The other three are monocular cues. All right, deep sleep, REM, paradoxical sleep, or dreaming, which does not belong. Now, to answer this question, we really need to focus on REM. What does REM stand for? Rapid eye movement. All right, here's what I know. I know that when you sleep, there are essentially two types of sleep, okay? And this will make sense. And knowing those two types is going to lead us to our answer. In fact, we can do kind of a little T-chart here to help us out. On one side, we're going to have REM. This is one type of sleep. And the other is when we don't have REM. That is called non-REM, right? NREM sleep, okay? Non-REM sleep. And what is the difference? Let's start with non-REM. The majority of sleep is in non-REM sleep, okay? This is considered stages, because there are stages of sleep, 1 through 3. Right? If I have my little kind of sleep chart here, I have 1, 2, 3, and sleep kind of looks something like this. Right? Here's my stages of sleep. What do we know about the stages of 1, 2, 3? Well, this is considered light sleep. That's stage 1. Right? You can scream at somebody, they're probably going to wake up. We have some hypnic jerks where I do something like this. We have stage 2, we have kind of sleep spindles, and then stage 3 is what we call deep sleep. Okay? Deep sleep. And if you look at an EEG, we'll have things like delta waves, okay? We have different types of waves and beta and theta and things like that, right? What else do we know about deep sleep? Well, this is when we have things like sleep disorders kick in, sleepwalking and sleep talking and things like that. Our immune system starts to function. We have kind of a repairing of the body if you're injured. This is what we call or consider non-REM sleep. Now, what about REM sleep? Well, REM sleep is considered really right up here, okay? We'll put a little R for REM sleep. It's like right before you wake up, you go into REM sleep, okay? What do I know about REM? Well, I know this is primarily when we dream, okay? So when your eyes are darting back and forth when you're sleeping, that tells us that we are dreaming. We also call REM sleep paradoxical sleep. And why do we call it a paradox? Well, we call it a paradox because, one, your brain is actually highly active. Your brain is active. But you know what's not active? Your body. Your body's paralyzed. Your body is inactive. Okay, paralysis. So it's this kind of paradox, this weird thing of my brain's very active, it's got a lot of activity on the EEG, but I can't move, right? Everything is paralyzed. So we have dreaming and we have paradoxical sleep. All right, does this help us with our answer? It does, because REM sleep is when we dream, and it's also called paradoxical sleep because of this kind of brain activity and body inactivity, which tells us what doesn't belong? It must be deep sleep, because that is part of non-REM. All right, number 4, specific phobia, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder known as GAD, or major depressive disorder, which does not belong. Now, on the AP exam, we're going to have to know the categories of disorders and the symptoms of those disorders as well. So let's start with the word anxiety. I think that's going to lead us to our answer. So in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's such a big name, we have a category called anxiety disorders, okay? And what we need to know is what disorders, okay, fall under this category. I think that'll lead us to an answer. So are there any here that fall under? There are. We have phobias, okay? These are irrational fear. We have a specific phobia. It seems like there are specific types. Things like fear of snakes and spiders and needles. We could have fear of social situations, social anxiety or social phobia. Fear of public speaking, we feel judged and evaluated. And we also have what we call agoraphobia. What is it? Agoraphobia, right? Fear of leaving our house. We might have a panic attack in a public place, right? So we kind of maybe stay indoors to avoid some sort of panic attack. And we also have panic disorder, okay? And this is characterized by panic attacks, right? These kind of unexplained, unexpected, coming out of nowhere feeling of dread and terror, like you might actually be dying or having a heart attack. But of course, that can't happen. We also have, this is a good one over here, generalized anxiety disorder, typically known as GAD. G-A-D. right? And this is kind of this just general feeling of uneasiness and worry that persists for 6 months or longer, right? That's just feeling at school, with family, you have kind of this persistent anxiety. So we have phobias, panic disorder, and general anxiety. All right, does this help us eliminate which one? It does, because the only one that is not an anxiety disorder is depression. All right, number 5, which does not belong? John B. Watson, Ivan Pavlov, Abraham Maslow, or B.F. Skinner? I love this question. We do need to know some big figures on the AP exam, and these are some of the 4 big hitters. So what do they do, and how can that lead us to which one does not belong? So let's start with a few of these. Let's start with one of the biggest ones, this guy right here. What is his name? Ivan Pavlov. All right, what do we know about Ivan Pavlov? Well, he's famous for his studies with dogs salivating at the sound of a bell. Right, let's use our terms. Our unconditioned stimulus would be food, causes a unconditioned response of what? Of salivating, okay? Salivating, another fancy word for drooling, okay? So that's Ivan Pavlov. Dog salivating at the sound of the bell. This is classical conditioning. All right, who else do we have? We have John B. Watson. What do we know about Watson? Well, Watson also focused on classical conditioning, but instead of dogs, this is a little unethical, we have the little Albert experiment. All right, what do we know about the little Albert's experiment? He conditioned a baby to fear a white rat. Yes, he gave and purposely gave a baby a phobia. Also part of classical conditioning. Now we also have B.F. Skinner right here. B.F. Skinner, Beatrice Frederick Skinner. What do you know about him? Well, unlike Pavlov and Watson, right? Pavlov did classical conditioning and Watson did classical conditioning. Skinner did something called operant conditioning. What is the difference? It is still about association, but it's associations based on consequences, right? Let's write that in together. Consequences, okay? Which means when you do a behavior, if it's followed by a pleasant consequence, you're going to do it again. If it's followed by an unpleasant consequence, you're less likely to do it again. So we have things like, reinforcements, and we have things like punishments. These shape our behavior. He did what we call the Skinner box or operant chamber, okay? All right, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Now, even though B.F. Skinner did operant conditioning, all 3 of these people have something in common. Do we know what that is? They are all what we call behaviorists, okay? What does that mean? It means they all argued that we are all shaped, our thoughts and actions are shaped by the environment, right? The reward and punishment, reinforcers, through conditioning and associations, we're all just kind of headless zombies walking around looking for reinforcers or avoiding punishments. Which tells us who does not belong? It must be Abraham Maslow. Now, why does Maslow not belong? He's a humanist, right? He's the opposite of behaviorist. He believes that we have free will, we are in control of our actions, and we're trying to reach our full potential. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All right, number 6, which does not belong? Pituitary, pons, pineal, or adrenal. Now, if you're thinking it must be adrenal because it's the only one that doesn't start with a P, you'd be wrong. But it does deal with our biology as well. All right, let's draw the brain and figure it out together. Here's our brain. I'll draw it to the best of my abilities. Here's our temporal lobe on the side, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. All right, let's start with our pituitary, okay? Our pituitary is kind of these like 2 lobes right here, okay? We have our hypothalamus underneath. Let's actually write that in together. Pituitary, okay? What do we know about our pituitary gland? Well, it is considered the master gland. Why? Because it controls all the other glands in the body. It's like the principal of a school and the teachers are all the other glands, right? Telling everybody what to do. It releases things like, oxytocin and growth hormones and things like that. All right, what else do we have? We have let's look right here, we have our pineal gland, all right? Which is about right here, okay? And what do we know about our pineal gland? Well, unlike the master gland, our pituitary gland, this deals with sleep. And it releases something called melatonin. This is a hormone. And it deals with making us nice and sleepy. It gets signals from our hypothalamus, specifically our SCN, and it helps control or regulate our circadian rhythm. All right, anything else? We have adrenal. Now, our adrenal is actually not in our brain. Our adrenal is down here in our kidneys. Or let me rephrase that, right above our kidneys, okay? All right, what do we know about our adrenal glands? Adrenal. Well, they typically deal with stress responses, okay? So it releases things like adrenaline, okay, adrenaline, and our stress hormone called cortisol, okay, cortisol, okay. So these are some stress hormones, okay. Now, is there anything missing? You'll notice it is our, where am I looking? It is our pons. Now, why does the pons not belong? Well, you'll notice pituitary, pineal, adrenal, they are all what? They are all glands. Pituitary gland, pineal gland, adrenal glands. The pons is a part of the brain. Here's our brainstem, and this little segment right here, bulging out of our brainstem, is our pons, okay? This helps control sleep and arousal. It helps control muscle paralysis during REM sleep. It is the only one that is not a gland. It does not belong in this group. All right, number 7, openness, agreeableness, impulsiveness, or neuroticism, which does not belong. Now, on the AP exam, they love to test you on something called the Big Five. These are different traits to describe human beings. All right, now one of them, of course, does not belong. So let's figure it out together. We have what? The Big Five. And the Big Five actually creates an acronym or a name. Let's write it out together. We have OCEAN. What does this spell? Ocean. And each letter stands for something. O, let's look right here, stands for openness. Okay. C stands for conscientiousness. Okay, conscientiousness. E, what do we have here? Nope, not here, but extroversion. Extroversion. A stands for, oh, we do have A right here, agreeableness. And what about N? N stands for neuroticism. Neuroticism. All right, so what do each one of these mean? Well, openness, if you score high in openness, this means that you were open to new ideas, right? You are somebody who's creative, you are not reserved, you like to try new things. Conscientiousness, how hardworking are you? Are you diligent? Are you on time? Extroversion, are you outgoing? Are you a people's person, right? Are you social? If you score high in agreeableness, you are caring and kind and nurturing. And neuroticism is basically about emotional stability. If you score high in neuroticism, that might be something like anxiety, right? These are the Big Five. And it's important to know these are on a spectrum, right? Where do you fall on this spectrum, right? I might be here, I might be here, you might fall somewhere. All right, which one doesn't belong? Well, the only one that doesn't belong is impulsiveness. This is not one of the Big Five. All right, number 8, which does not belong? Central nervous system, autonomic nervous system, somatic nervous system, or your peripheral nervous system. Now, to get to this answer, we have to know how the nervous system is structured. So let's write nervous system up here, and here's what we need to know. The nervous system can be divided into really 2 parts, or types. We have the central nervous system and what? The peripheral nervous system. All right, what is the difference? Well, your central nervous system is made up of 2 parts. Your brain, there's my lovely drawing of the brain, and your spinal cord. Okay, your spinal cord. Okay, and all the information from your body, your peripheral, is going to go to our central nervous system, right, to be relayed, and then go up to the brain to be processed. There's our central nervous system. Now, what about our peripheral nervous system? Well, we can break this apart. It is further divided into 2 parts. Our somatic nervous system, okay, this is our muscles, or what we'll call voluntary movement, right? I choose to move, and what we call our autonomic nervous system, okay? These are things that I do involuntarily, okay, involuntary, right? Digestion and heartbeat, breathing right here is kind of a little heartbeat to remember that, okay? Somatic and autonomic. Now, the autonomic can further be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic as well. All right, does this help us? It does. You know why? Because the only one that doesn't belong is the central. Why? Because the peripheral is divided into the autonomic and somatic. The central is an entire different system. All right, number 9, superego, id, immediate gratification, or the pleasure principle. Now, if you're thinking this deals with our good friend Sigmund Freud, we are on the right track. But of course, one does not belong. Now, whenever I think about Freud, I always like to, do my little iceberg, right? The idea that a lot of our thoughts and actions in his argument are deep below the surface, right? Here's our unconscious, okay? And all these thoughts are slowly creeping up to the surface, and we don't want that to happen according to Freud, right? That's the seed of anxiety and mental illness, all right? Now, his argument is that our personality is shaped by really three forces, and this is going to help us get to our answer. We have our id, okay? We have our ego, and we know the third one? Our superego, okay? And I kind of like to put, some visuals for this. For the id, I always like to think about the devil, some sort of guy with horns, and we got a little devil tail, something like this. Yeah, I guess that's a devil tail. Our superego may be somebody with, a little halo, and they got some angel wings, okay? And then the ego, the ego is more of kind of a balance. We can kind of have a balance beam here, okay? Now, why is that? Well, the id is considered our pleasure principle. Okay? It wants anything that feels good. And not only that, but it wants things right now, which we call immediate what? Immediate gratification. I'm not going to wait. Gratification, right? I need it right now, okay? Think of this as our animal instinct. Why? We don't think about the consequences. Think about babies. They just cry when they want something. This is our id. It is the source. Think about the devil analogy. Now, we also have the ego. This is the reality principle, okay? You can't always get what you want. Okay, I know that's a song. The ego has to kind of decide what is appropriate. It has to take into account the situation or the reality of what is actually happening, okay? And then the superego, this is considered our moral principle, okay? This is like the ideal self, the perfect self, right? The perfect person that we will never be, okay? It tells us what's right and wrong and what the perfect decision would be. And what we have to decide, as the ego has to decide, is how do we make the id happy, because it wants pleasure, but not offend the superego, because if we do offend the superego, it's going to make us feel very guilty, okay? And we don't want to feel too guilty. All right, does this help us answer our question? Superego, id, immediate gratification, pleasure? It does, because the id is made up of the pleasure principle, and it wants things now. The superego does not belong. All right, number 10, sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, formal stage, and conventional stage. Now, for the AP exam, there's a lot of what we call stage theories. Stage theory is the idea that as you grow up, right, as you go from birth until adulthood, you develop in stages, from this to this to this, as opposed to some sort of gradual continuum of life. This is one stage theory. So stage theories like Erikson and Piaget and Kohlberg, which one are we referring to? Well, let's focus on a few of these. Let's start with the sensory motor stage, okay? Well, we need to know, and what I know this belongs to, is Jean Piaget. Okay, what did he care about? The stages of cognitive development. How does a baby grow in terms of their mental capacity? Okay, well, according to Piaget, we start with what we call the sensory motor stage. Okay, what is the stage? Well, it's about 0 to 2 years old. And most importantly, the stage, what develops? Something called object permanence. Okay? The idea that just because you can't see something, you still know it exists. Take a baby, hide a toy, see if they know that it still exists. So that is considered stage 1. All right, we also have stage 2, called the pre-operational stage. Okay, this might be considered, 2 to 7 years old. And this is the stage where children start thinking not in terms of touching and using their senses, but in terms of language. Okay, language starts to develop. Okay, and they start thinking in terms of their mental images, right? They can think about objects in their mind, but of course, this is not necessarily a good thing. They can be very egocentric, right? They only see the world through their perspective. Okay? They don't see other people's thoughts and opinions and how it's different from their own. All right, we also have third, the concrete operational stage. Okay, concrete operational, and this would be, let's say 7 to 11 years old, and this is when logic kicks in. Oh, Santa's not real, right? This is when we might realize that, and this is when children also master something called conservation. Just because you change the shape of something doesn't mean its properties also change, right? You could break something into a million pieces, it's still going to weigh the same. All right, lastly, we have our fourth stage, the formal operational stage, okay? Let's say anything above 11 years old. And according to Piaget, we can have, talks about, hypothetical things that have never happened before. So hypothetical thinking, abstract concepts, abstract concepts. This is the formal stage, right? This is Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So what doesn't belong? The conventional stage, right? We have sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete, and formal. Why? This is Colbert's stage of morality, right? The idea we make moral decisions based on social approval.